Have you ever heard about the 7 core issues of adoption? You know, everyone seems to think that adoption is joyful. And while it is a joyful event, there are, it does impact people, not necessarily all in a positive way. So let's dive into that today on All About Adoption. Hi, I'm Stephanie A., and let's get started. So in 1982, there was an article by Silverstein and Kaplan that was called The 7 Core Issues of Adoption. And in 2019, this was updated by Rosia and Maxson. What are the 7 core issues of adoption? So we'll start with, I'll list them out and then we'll go into detail about each one. So the first one is loss, and the second one's rejection. The third is shame and guilt. The fourth is grief. The fifth is identity. The sixth is intimacy. And the seventh is mastery and control. Now let's talk about how these 7 issues impact everyone in the adoption triad. Number 1, let's talk about loss. Let's be real. Adoption, there's a lot of loss for everyone that's involved. For the birth parents who've placed a child, they have the loss of raising their child. For adopted persons, they have the loss of being raised by their birth family. And then for the adopting family, they a lot of times will come to adoption through infertility. So they have the loss of being able to have a child biologically. Rejection. So with the birth family, there is a thought of being rejected by others who may not agree with them making an adoption plan. Also with persons who, I'm going to call them adoptees. So with adoptees, they have rejection. They feel rejection because they were placed for adoption, so therefore they feel rejected by their birth family. And then also the adopting families sometimes are fearful, especially if they've adopted a child who is older, that the child will start rejecting them as their parents. Shame and guilt. So the birth family can feel shame and guilt for having an unplanned pregnancy, and that putting them into the position of where they felt adoption was the right thing to do. For adoptees, there's shame and guilt in being placed for adoption. So especially if a child is placed when they're older, they can feel like they did something wrong. They can have guilt that if they had just been a better child, they wouldn't have been placed for adoption. And then the adopted family just feeling shame and guilt of not being able to have had a child biologically. Grief. This is pretty natural for the birth family to feel grief over having the loss of not being able to parent the child they gave birth to. The grief also, once again, is connected to being placed for adoption and not being able to be raised by their birth family. And then with adopting parents, also the grief of not being able to having given birth to the child that they're raising. Identity. So for birth families, that can play out in the identity of knowing that they gave birth to this child and that they are, for example, the mother of the child, but yet they're not raising the child. So it really can cause identity issues in really what is their relationship with this child. Identity, especially for adoptees who may be in a closed adoption or who were adopted internationally, just not having their medical background, their genetic information, and just not knowing, more about who they are. For adoptive families, identity issues can come for not feeling like the real parents. They can experience those emotions as well. Intimacy. So the birth family can feel a real disconnect between becoming pregnant and placing a child for adoption, and that grief that they experience. They can relate that towards having a difficult time with intimacy in the future, of just having that grief wrapped up and having difficulty forming relationships with other people down the road, just because that's so much tied into having placed a child for adoption. Intimacy is a big thing for adoptees, and just feeling, Evan earlier, feeling rejected, and therefore they have trouble with intimacy down the road sometimes because they're afraid of that rejection again. So it can impact the relationships down the road. When you come from infertility, the adoptive parents could really have problems with intimacy and knowing that, when they have relationships with each other, that they're not able to have a child biologically, and that can impact the intimacy between the adopting family, the adopting parents. Mastery and control, this is a big one for birth families. The unplanned pregnancy, things are out of their control. This wasn't what they planned, and they find themselves looking at an adoption, which is not something most families want to face with an unplanned pregnancy, but they find that they do, and so they just feel really out of control. Adoptees feel this in the fact that this decision to be placed for adoption was totally out of their control. This decision was made by the adults in their life, and therefore it impacts them long term. And adoptive parents, this is a big one, particularly when you're going through the adoption process. Pretty much everything is out of your control. It's out of your control how long the adoption process takes. It's out of your control if you're once you are matched with an expecting parent, it's out of your control whether she decides to place her child for adoption with you. So this one is really hard for families, particularly when they're used to having control in their lives, that when you go through the adoption process, you pretty much have to let that control go. So adoption is bittersweet, and just having an understanding of these 7 core issues of adoptions just really helps everyone to understand each other better and to be able to experience the adoption process fully, and to be able to get help when help is needed if they find that they are stuck in one of these areas and that the feelings they're having are normal. So I hope this is helpful to you down the road and when you find yourself facing one of these 7 core issues in adoption. So take care. Thanks. Bye.